I want to thank all of you for coming out today to hear this 8th of 9 lectures being supported in part or in total by the African American Heritage House. We're nearing the completion of our inaugural season, and each week seems to get better and better. And having seen today's speaker numerous times on TV and in action, I am positive that that tradition will continue today. My name is Errol Davis. I serve as chair of the board of the African American Heritage House here at the Chautauqua Institution. It is an organization informed by the African American experience, committed to strengthening Chautauqua by encouraging and welcoming diversity, by fostering honest, candid conversations, and by adding new voices to the programmatic mix. Thank you. In the Chautauqua tradition, just as in the last session, there will be a moderated Q&A session, and I will ask you after the speech to line up at the microphones. But tomorrow at 12:15 at the African American Heritage House, which is right at 38 Clark on the Brick Walk, just a block and a half down the street on the corner of Foster, there will be a Chautauqua Dialogue. These are sponsored by the Department of Religion. They will be hosted by the African American Heritage House. Now, the focus of tomorrow's dialogue will be your reactions to the remarks you've heard here today. We're going to discuss sensitive topics here today, so I was listening in the last session, and I note that a lot of people had comments, and there was a kernel of a question in some of them. But I would appreciate if you want to make statements, come to the dialogue tomorrow at 12:15, and instead of in the question and answer period here today. Your fellow Chautauquans and visitors would appreciate that, so we can get more questions answered as well. But do join your fellow Chautauquans tomorrow at 12:15 at 38 Clark. Today's presentation is made possible through the generosity of a number of supporters dedicated to making sure that historical and social justice issues, as seen through an African American perspective, can be heard on the grounds of the institution. So please join me in thanking our contributors for making this presentation possible. The presentation is being recorded, and it will be available on our website, AAHH8.org. It is on the bottom of the program, but unfortunately, we only had about 300 programs, and there are substantially more than 300 people here. So that's AAHH8.org. Fortunately, this concludes today's announcements. We began this season by noting that 2019 is the 400th anniversary of the introduction of slavery into the Americas, and that we were pleased to present a season-long lecture series relating to the experiences of African Americans over the last, and other marginalized people over the last 400 years. It's been a season of learning. We learned 2 weeks ago that 1619 did not mark the introduction of slavery in the Americas. It marked the introduction of slavery by the English, and that the Spaniards had held Africans and indigenous people in slavery long before the 1619 date. And so what we learned for that is our history is not just English history. As I look back over the last 7 weeks, we've had a number of highly acclaimed academic historians, and we will have one today. We've had a businessman turned museum founder, as well as a dynamic young politician, Stacey Abrams. Through all 7 lectures, the point was made time and time again that we can learn from both the past and the present. Today's speaker is going to test the boundaries of learning from both the past and the present. It is often said that history is written by the victors, but that is clearly not the case when the history surrounding the oxymoronically named conflict called the Civil War. If the victors wrote the history, Would Robert E. Lee be seen in the benign way that he is seen today as a great general, a leader, a tactician, an old uncle? Or would he be seen as the man who is responsible for more American deaths than Adolf Hitler and Emperor Hirohito combined? But our speaker is going to talk about who gets to write the history and how it was written. Today's speaker is Dr. Stan Deaton. He is a true son of the South, dedicated to making sure that our view of history is fact-based and not emotionally based. Stan Deaton is the Dr. Elaine B. Andrews Distinguished Historian at the Georgia Historical Society, where he has worked since 1998. He holds a PhD in history from the University of Florida, a master's in history from the University of Georgia, and a bachelor's in journalism from the Grady School at the University of Georgia. Stan is a public historian, and as a public historian, he has received 2 Emmy Awards in 2013 from the National Academy of Television Arts and Sciences, Southeast Region, as writer and host of Today in Georgia History, which is jointly produced by the Georgia Historical Society and Georgia Public Broadcasting. He currently hosts This Is Our History, produced jointly with the NBC affiliate in Savannah, Georgia, where the Historical Society is located. He records podcasts and writes a blog called Off the Deaton Path. The URLs for all of this can be found in today's program, and we will also post them on our website. He serves as the managing editor for the Georgia Historical Quarterly and editor of the Society's news magazine, Georgia History Today. He is regularly interviewed for historical documentaries and by broadcast and print media on a variety of subjects related to history in the news, and you will soon see why. Please join me in giving a warm Chautauqua welcome to Dr. Stan Deaton.
Thank you, Errol, and thank you all. What a privilege it is to be here at this distinguished podium in this place. This is my first time here. Thank you, Errol, and to the African American Heritage House for having me here to talk about Confederate monuments. Thank you, Heather. Is Heather still here? For the shout out. That was amazing. It's a hard act to follow, and I don't know that I can do that. But the other thing I wanted to say is I don't know how you people stand this weather. I'll let you in on a little secret. In the rest of the world, it's August. I don't know what this is, but it is not August. In Savannah today, the heat index was 115. So I'm very happy to be here. We call this November. Whatever you're having right now is amazing. I was also told that I would get extra points up here if I actually took this tie off at the podium. I'm sorry, this is just the uniform I have to wear all the time. And the Georgia Historical Society would be displeased if I came up here dressed like you all, and I would love to be. But you have all made me feel very welcome, and I really thank you for that. And I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you today about Confederate monuments. How many of you have seen the movie 1776, the great musical? It was produced in 1972. So there's a moment in there, the Continental Congress votes on whether they should dare debate the then radical idea of independence from Great Britain. Stephen Hopkins of Rhode Island famously thunders, "Well, in all my years, I ain't never heard, seen, nor smelled an issue that was so dangerous it couldn't be talked about. Hell yeah, I'm for debate, and Rhode Island says yay." Now, in the spirit of Stephen Hopkins and this institution, we're going to talk today about some very controversial topics having to do with memory, race, and history. Dangerous and potentially divisive topics, but not so dangerous that they can't be talked about in a civil exchange of ideas for which this institution is world-renowned. I'm sure everybody emptied their pockets of rocks before they came in. So first I want to start in 1945, all right? In the aftermath of World War II, beginning in 1945, as the war against the Nazis turned into a Cold War against the Russians, a very curious thing happened. We just celebrated the 50th anniversary of the moon landing, And one of the things that was made crystal clear, particularly if you read Douglas Brinkley's new book called American Moonshot, is that Nazi rocket scientists like Wernher von Braun were essential to the success of America's space race. Von Braun was an SS officer who presided over a slave labor camp that built V-2 rockets in Germany. And later, working for NASA, he developed the Saturn rocket that launched Apollo 11 on its historic moonshot. Keeping Nazi scientists out of Russian hands became more important after the war than punishing them for war crimes. In similar fashion, there was another movement that began after World War II on courthouse squares all over the country. Many of you may remember it. Monuments to German and Japanese soldiers who had recently fought against the armed forces of the United States began going up all over the country, from one county to another across the United States. These monuments went up, first slowly as a way of memorializing and mourning the dead. Then later in the 1950s and 1960s as celebratory, as a way of commemorating the Nazi and Japanese cause. Then by the 1970s, these monuments were almost defiant. There was no mention in any of these monuments of Adolf Hitler or Tojo, no mention of the SS or the concentration camps or the Holocaust or the rape of Nanking or the fact that the Japanese had started the war by attacking a U.S. military establishment. They completely whitewashed what the Nazi cause had been about. If you look and count them, there are now over 1,500 of these across the American landscape, and some people are calling for their removal. Others say, well, you can't erase history. You can't take these down. That's tantamount to censorship. So what do we do with these Nazis and Japanese monuments? Now, before you pull out your phone to make sure you didn't miss a notification from a parallel universe, I should tell you, of course, that this didn't actually happen. Now, at least not the last part. The part about the Nazi rocket scientists is absolutely true. I didn't make that up. It wasn't the Nazis or the Japanese as combatant enemies of the United States who were the subjects of these monuments, but another combatant enemy of the United States, erected much earlier, but still going on, the only combatant enemy that has ever been allowed to erect monuments to its cause and to its soldiers on American soil in such large numbers. I'm talking, of course, about the Confederate States of America. And no, I'm not comparing that to the Nazi or Japanese regimes, not explicitly anyway, merely using them to make a point about combatant enemies, and I want you to keep that in mind. Confederate monuments, where do they come from? How did they get here? What do they mean? What do the people who put them up think they meant? And really important for us, what the heck do we do about them? Really, it's not just Confederate monuments we're talking about now. This past weekend's New York Times published an article about the San Francisco School Board's dilemma about what to do with a controversial mural of George Washington that graces the entry to one of its schools. It was painted during the New Deal by Depression-era artists and depicts Washington's interactions, among others, with Indians and slaves. Some want it painted over. Some want it preserved. One of the titles that I give for this talk, a version of it anyway, is called Hero Today, Gone Tomorrow. And I want to start with that, because that's really the genesis and the germ of most monuments and most things like this, right? An effort to make heroes or to celebrate heroes. So I want to start with the notion of heroes, and I will tie all this together, I promise. Let's start with the easy part first, right? Our own individual heroes. We all have them. How we go about selecting them, what happens to them as we grow and mature. We all grew up with childhood heroes that we worship and revere, although that adoration rarely lasts into adulthood. That may be because you simply outgrow them or because as we age, what we need from our heroes changes as well. And the people we deem our heroes may change over time. I saw recently on Facebook that one of my friends now loathed a country music star for a recent controversy over gun rights and the Second Amendment, and he said he was no longer one of his heroes. He just simply changed his mind about it. Other people now admired the same person for the very same reason. In our current media culture, whereas Ken Burns recently said, we are buried in information, but we know nothing. Heroes come and go daily, right? Maybe you've stopped seeing Tom Cruise's movies because you don't like his views as a follower of the Church of Scientology. Perhaps you no longer admire Bill Cosby or Brian Williams of NBC News. This is our own brand, right, of personal historical revisionism. And it happens all the time, and quite frankly, it's no big deal. Same thing happens to our country's heroes and our history on a larger scale, and when it does, it can cause cultural upheaval. We not only choose our heroes selectively, but not always in their totality. Some people find Hemingway to be one of their great literary heroes. Others loathe him for his womanizing and his alcoholism. Sports heroes are notorious for juggling great athletic feats with sometimes criminal personal behavior or controversial political acts. The Rolling Stones have collectively been my musical heroes since I was a teenager, but not one of them would ever be nominated for sainthood, right? We're very selective about that. And these days, the way in which we as a culture settle on who is and who is not a hero can be highly problematic. Heroism can be nothing more nowadays than a certain amount of celebrity, which can be had now for nothing more than a snarky tweet. One need only peruse your own Facebook feed to see the wisdom in Senator Everett Dirksen's famous remark, "Occasionally you should enjoy the pleasure of an unexpressed thought." As Roger Cohen said not long ago in the New York Times, too often we confuse activity with movement, or activity and movement with accomplishment. They are not the same things. The problem with heroes is that they are people to be admired, openly celebrated. Those of us who practice history as a profession have to be wary of them and of anyone who champions heroes while claiming to be a historian. If you choose to write a biography of someone that you identify as a hero, not just admire, but really a hero, you're probably going to wind up with hagiography, right? Hero worship. Heroes blind us to their faults and make us struggle to look at someone openly and honestly in their totality. And the way we construct our heroes has a lot to do with the ways we construct our own history and the way we think about it. Dealing with history and heroes in the public arena is therefore not a straightforward process. The Holocaust is a good example. It's easy for all of us to draw stark and moral conclusions about the Holocaust and the evils of genocide and racial hatred as expressed in that event. It's fairly straightforward for most people, or at least it used to be. But what about American slavery or lynchings in this country, or those who defended American slavery or took part in lynchings? How do we deal with them in the public arena? It's not straightforward at all. How about slaves like Nat Turner who murdered white people in the name of freedom? Are they to be considered as heroes? What about whites who openly encouraged or condoned lynchings like Georgia's own Tom Watson? Charleston has a Holocaust memorial in Marion Square, yet it rejected placing a monument to Denmark Vesey, who led a slave revolt in the same place. Now, as one historian pointed out, Charlestonians denouncing racism abroad while overlooking a long history at home struck some as what they called commemorative sleight of hand that made some people very uncomfortable. Let's turn that around. What if German communities erected memorials to American slaves before acknowledging the horror of their own Holocaust? We think they were practicing a delusional collective amnesia, and yet many American communities avoid open discussions of their own past, questioning the need to, as they say, bring that back up again. Why are you bringing that back up? Everybody's forgotten about that lynching. Why are you talking about it again? When the that in question has anything to do with a particularly ugly moment in our collective past, especially if it has to do with the third rail in American history, race. Which brings us to Confederate monuments and iconography. Now, there's been a lot of discussion, particularly really in places like Georgia going back decades, but since 2015 nationally, over what Confederate and segregation-era symbolism means. Much of it supposedly based on history. And quite frankly, much of it should get an F. It's appalling, really, and you've heard them, right? Here we go. We're going to tick off some of these things, supposedly. But the Confederacy and Confederate symbolism isn't about slavery or the preservation of slavery, because slavery didn't cause the Civil War. Now, some of you who have never lived in the South, you may be going, people really believe that? Oh my, yes. Yes, they do. They write letters, too. My ancestors, this is another one. My ancestors who fought for the Confederacy didn't own slaves, so it wasn't about slavery. If you're going to take down the Confederate flag, you have to take down the U.S. flag, too, because it flew over slavery much longer than the Confederate flag. If you take down Jefferson Davis's statue, you have to take down Thomas Jefferson's statue, too, because he was a slave owner. Monuments are history. You can't take them down. We'll be erasing history. And so on. Okay, so let me just say one thing right from the start. Disclaimer. I'm not here to convince anyone to take down a monument or a statue. Each community, if it chooses, can have that discussion and make up its own mind, and it will be up for them to decide if they decide to do anything at all based on their values. I'm not arguing for one thing or another, but what I am advocating for and what I hope I would want you to do is that if we're going to have a discussion about this, let's get the history right. Okay, let's do that. In order to understand the current controversy over Confederate memorials and iconography in contemporary American culture, it's essential to have an understanding of the origins of the Confederacy, how it and the Civil War have been interpreted over the past 150 years. So let's start with this. It's impossible to understand American history between the Constitution of 1787 and the outbreak of the war in 1861 without understanding the centrality of slavery and the great national debate over its preservation and its extension. Every major event in the United States between 1820 and 61 had to do with slavery in some fashion, whether it was the Missouri Compromise of 1820, the nullification controversy of 1832, Nat Turner's uprising in Virginia, the Mexican War and its aftermath, the Compromise of 1850, Bleeding Kansas, Dred Scott versus Sanford, and of course secession itself. Why did the white Southerners who formed the Confederacy in 1861 act as they did? Well, we don't have to get a crystal ball. We don't have to sit here with a Ouija board and go, I just don't understand. We don't know exactly what. We know exactly what they were doing because they wrote it down. They told us. It is no secret. All anyone has to do to understand why white Southerners favored secession is to read the written and spoken words of the men who worked so hard, sometimes for 30 years, to dissolve the Union. They were not equivocal about it. They didn't leave any doubt for their reasons, at least not in 1861, for what they were doing, and they made no secret of it. White Southerners made clear for more than 30 years that they would break up the Union if needed in order to defend the institution of slavery. As long as the United States would do it, great, we'll stay here. As long as Virginia or some other southern state will do it, great, we'll stay here. But slavery and white supremacy must be maintained at all costs, not only as an economic system, but as a system of racial control. And everybody understood that, even the people who didn't own slaves. And if that meant breaking up the United States as it then existed, then that is what would happen. To now claim, 150 years after the end of the Civil War, that the Confederate States of America and the war fought to create it didn't have slavery at its root cause is tantamount to arguing that the Nazis were not anti-Semitic, that the moon landing was fake, that the earth is flat, or that the Holocaust didn't happen. It's there. Now, the Confederates who took their states out of the Union in 1860 and 61 could not have been clearer about why they were doing it. They viewed the election of Abraham Lincoln and the success of the Republican Party in the 1860 election, because of the party's support for restricting the expansion of slavery, if not its eventual outright abolition, as a direct threat to the institution of slavery, both where it already existed in the U.S. South and the U.S. territories where it might exist, but weren't yet states. And as the states seceded, beginning with South Carolina in December 1860, they, like our founders, like Jefferson, felt the need to tell the world in stark language why they would take this radical step, this extraordinary step. The Mississippi Secession Convention had a declaration of immediate causes. It states at the outset, and I quote here, "Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest in the world." Unquote. After compiling a list of grievances that Mississippi said they had been subjected to, all of which concerned slavery and the affronts to it from the northern states, Mississippi stated that under a Lincoln administration, quote, "we must either submit to degradation and to the loss of property worth $4 billion of money, or we must secede from the Union." Don't need a crystal ball. The only mention of states' rights, as in most other secession documents, is complaining that the free states had been given the liberty by the federal government to ignore the fugitive slave laws instead of compelling northern states to abide by the law. In other words, the secessionists were demanding fewer states' rights, not more. Okay, Florida's cause of secession, for secession, January 7, 1861, cites, quote, "the strength of the anti-slavery sentiment of the free states as the reason Florida must secede." Alabama's resolution of resistance and ordinance of secession cites the election as president and vice president, two members of what it called the Black Republican Party, who supported, quote, "the avowed principle that the Constitution does not recognize property in slaves, and that the government should prevent its extension into the common territories of the states, and that the power of the government should be exercised so that slavery in time should be exterminated." They were very afraid for slavery. Now, in my own state of Georgia, the Declaration of Causes, the word slavery or anti-slavery appears 27 times. On the other hand, the other causes cited by modern-day defenders of the Confederacy, states' rights and the tariff, Zero, not once. Quote, "For the last 10 years, we have had numerous and serious causes of complaint against our non-slaveholding Confederate states with reference to the subject of African slavery," unquote. It goes on to cite a litany of complaints, all of which have to do with slavery and Georgia's opposition to what it called Negro equality. The Arkansas secession resolutions had 6 resolutions. Every single one had to do with slavery, preserving it where it existed, enforcing the fugitive slave law, and being able to take slaves into territories and free states. Tennessee Governor Isham Harris declared his state, quote, "would give her strength to the sacred cause of freedom for the white man of the South." Now, maybe these documents were not forceful enough to convince the border states of the Upper South, like Virginia, that did not immediately secede. In that case, some of these states sent out officially designated secession commissioners. These are ambassadors of secession, if you will, to other slaveholding states to convince them to get in on the secession movement. Now, Georgia's official commissioner was Henry Benning, for whom Fort Benning is named. Let the irony sink in for a moment. A federal military installation named Fort Benning. The state of Georgia officially sent him to Virginia to convince the Old Dominion to join the cause of disunion. And he stood before the Virginia legislature as I stand before you, and he said this. Listen carefully. See if you can pick out. It's tough. You're going to have to listen. Quote, "What was the reason that induced Georgia to take the step of secession? The reason may be summed up in one single proposition. It was a conviction, a deep conviction on the part of Georgia that a separation from the North was the only thing that could prevent the abolition of her slaves." Here's the next part. This conviction was the main cause, he said. If it hadn't been for this, we would not have taken this step. Where have these words been lost in 150 years? How is it that that is so hard to divine these people are not hiding behind anything? Speaking for the people of Georgia, Benning warned his fellow slaveholders in Virginia, quote, "The North is acquiring the power to abolish slavery in the cotton states. What kind of thing will that abolition be?" And what he describes next is a biracial society. The black race will go into political power. And those states will have black governors, black judges, black legislators, black juries, black witnesses, everything black. Is it to be supposed the white race will stand for that? I'm not sure what he means. I do know he's not afraid of the tariff. All right, Virginia seceded on April 17 in Resolution 2, and its secession document states that the reason was because it wished to defend the institution of slavery. Now, Confederate Vice President Alexander Stephens of Georgia gave official voice to the pro-slavery origin of the Confederacy in what became famously known as his cornerstone speech. You often see this cited. He came to Savannah March 22nd, 1861, in which he famously said, quote, "Our new government is founded upon exactly the opposite idea, that all men are created equal. Its foundations are laid, its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man. That slavery, subordination to the superior race, is his natural and moral condition. This, our new government, is the first in the history of the world based upon this great physical, philosophical, and moral truth." 70 years later, none other than Adolf Hitler agreed with Stephens. He is quoted in Joe Lepore's new book, This America. Hitler regretted the Confederacy's defeat. He said, quote, "The beginnings of a great new social order based on the principle of slavery and inequality were destroyed by that war." Now, these are not just some random individuals going off half-cocked on their Twitter feeds, right? These are the official representatives sent out by the states that have already seceded to convince other states to do the same, and Confederate Vice President Alexander Stephens. And the promise to preserve slavery was the rock upon which they hoped to convince these other states. Here's the important part. They were not ashamed of this. They did not have a problem with this. The problem is ours. They thought the future would be better if it had slavery in it. They wanted all of the future to be able to own slaves, and they were not ashamed of that. They were staking everything upon this belief. When we shy away from that now, when we act as if slavery or a desire to preserve it had either nothing to do with the formation of the Confederacy or we try to downplay it as being of some minor consequence, we are doing them a grave disservice and engaging in the most blatant form of political correctness imaginable. Just because slavery has fallen out of moral fashion doesn't mean you can turn a blind eye to it when you decide to celebrate the Confederacy in 2019. They would have been bewildered by that. They would say, what are you doing? So let me be clear. This is not meant to judge the Confederates, but merely to state what they themselves said they were doing. Not in 1865 when the war was over, not in 1875 when they were writing memoirs, not in 2019 when pro-Confederate groups want to deny all connection to slavery and white supremacy. But in the spring of 1861 as they took their states out of the Union. Many neo-Confederates today point to the fact that ending slavery was not an immediate war aim of President Lincoln and the U.S. government in 1861. This is true only to the extent that Lincoln did all he could to reassure the southern states after his election that he had no intention and, quite frankly, no authority under the U.S. Constitution to interfere with slavery in states where it already existed. But he was determined, as was his party, to restrict the extension of slavery into the new territories of the West in order to prevent the formation of new slave states. And though ending slavery was not an immediate war aim, that doesn't mean that the agitation over slavery didn't play a leading role in causing the conflict to begin with. Southerners like Alexander Stephens, again, warned that by taking their states out of the Union, by waging war against the United States, secessionists would give Lincoln the excuse he needed to send an army into the southern states and attack slavery as a war aim. And of course, that is exactly what happened. Stephens said, at the end of the day, secessionists were the most practical abolitionists of all. So by 1862, Lincoln understood that as long as slavery existed in the United States, the threat of secession and civil war would remain a constant threat. In September 1862, following the Battle of Antietam, the eradication of slavery became official policy of the United States government. After that date, all whites fighting for the Confederate Army understood that white supremacy was at stake in the southern states, regardless of whether an individual owned slaves or not. And let me be clear, the Confederate Constitution had slavery written perpetually into it. So if you were fighting for a government written under that Constitution, then you were fighting for slavery, regardless of whether you owned slaves or not. So, having laid all of this before the bar of history, this would explain why on every Confederate monument in the country, slavery and its preservation is listed among the reasons for the war and the cause for which so many fought and died. Except, of course, it is not there at all. It's missing. Not once. If you find a monument to the Confederacy in this country that says, we fought for the preservation of slavery, I will eat it. We will all sit down together and eat it. They aren't there. Why? What happened? Well, after the war, in one of the most blatant and pernicious acts of historical revisionism ever undertaken, and one of the most far-reaching, former Confederates obliterated and repeatedly denied any link between the Confederacy and the preservation of slavery. Why? Because it was no longer racially correct after the war to have attempted to destroy the United States over such a thing as morally repugnant as the preservation of slavery. It had to have been about something greater than that, right? All that blood, all that destruction, an entire generation laid waste, and for what? This is the germ of the myth of the lost cause. It supplied a heroic interpretation of the war so that Southerners could maintain their sense of honor. A Georgian, Clement Evans, a war veteran, put it this way, quote, if we cannot justify the South in the act of secession, we will go down in history solely as a brave, impulsive, but rash people who attempted in an illegal manner to overthrow the union of our country. We'll be traitors, he said, basically. So in the aftermath of the war, the white South, facing catastrophic loss of life and destruction, wrote its own history of the war. It cast itself as the underdog, overwhelmed by superior numbers, but whose cause, a noble fight for states' rights, for home rule, anything but slavery, was just. The war was cast not as a rebellion against lawful authority in order to establish a slave-holding republic, but as a Southern independence movement that had repelled an invading industrialized army of shopkeepers in order to protect the homeland and white Southern womanhood in some idyllic, romanticized, chivalric, rural way of life. Having failed to achieve their aims through secession and war, former Confederates sought to create culturally and spiritually what they could not achieve militarily and politically, a separate Southern nation. They fused the imagery and symbolism of Christianity and the Confederacy to create a civil religion, the lost cause. Lost Cause proponents preached the message that adherence to the civility and the racial dogma of the pre-war South meant that the cause was not and would never be truly lost. Victory would come if white Southerners maintained their superior and pure white culture. The South need not be separate politically to rise again spiritually. This message was spread far and wide by agents of the Lost Cause, and Confederate monuments are ground zero. Crucial part of this message. That's what you see when you're looking at them. Now, despite the well-documented history of the Civil War, legions of Southerners, and not just Southerners, still cling to the myth of the Lost Cause as a noble endeavor to defend the region's honor and its ability to govern itself in the face of Northern aggression. This deeply rooted but false narrative is the result of many decades of creating a more acceptable and morally sanitized version of the region's past. Gone is the notion that the Confederacy was founded to preserve slavery. Gone is the notion that Confederate victory meant the destruction of the United States as it existed, the world's only republic, as it existed in 1860. Gone is any notion that the Confederate cause was treason. The most widely popular rendering of the Lost Cause can still be seen in Birth of a Nation and Gone with the Wind. Confederate monuments and other symbols of the Confederacy that dot the South are very much a part of the effort to shape the narrative and convince the world that states' rights rather than slavery was the cornerstone of the Confederacy. And as I mentioned, there are now more than 1,500 symbols of the Confederacy in public spaces in 31 states and the District of Columbia. When we talk about the place of Confederate monuments in contemporary American society, we should consider the political context in which the statues and monuments have been erected. Since 1894, there has been a concerted campaign to commemorate the Confederacy through memorialization and education that would more properly be considered propaganda. Organizations like the United Daughters of the Confederacy, founded in 1894, quote, to perpetuate the memory of our Confederate heroes and the glorious cause for which they fought, unquote, and the Sons of Confederate Veterans, founded in 1896, promoted Confederate monuments, museums, and educational activities that emphasize states' rights rather than slavery as the cause of the Civil War. The erection of Confederate monuments spiked during three distinct periods. The 10 years following the end of the war in 1865, the last decade of the 19th and the first 2 decades of the 20th century, and the 1950s and 60s. The monuments from these periods reflect changing attitudes about the memory of the war and the use of Confederate symbols in order to achieve certain political and social goals and objectives. They go through the funereal stage first, the celebratory, and then defiance. The first monuments were erected very shortly after the war by grieving white Southerners to honor the valor of fallen leaders and loved ones. On every Southern corner, you would see veterans missing legs, missing arms. Every table across the South had missing chairs, and it was a natural response to the loss of life. Most are simple and non-military in design, obelisks, shafts, pyramids, and feature wording that expresses the grief which its builders were experiencing. By the 1890s, that grief had abated. The second wave of monument building encompassed the years when states were passing Jim Crow laws, disenfranchising African Americans. The erection of these Confederate memorials and enforcement of Jim Crow went hand in hand. Many were intended as celebration of white supremacy. When they were constructed, when they were first opened to the public, unveiled, if you will, many of the speeches used language of white supremacy. Many were intended as a celebration of white supremacy when they were constructed. At best, they are an effort to whitewash the issues of slavery and, let's not forget, rebellion against the United States out of our collective memory. Who even talks about these people as having committed treason now? These people, whether it be Robert E. Lee or anybody, my ancestors, whoever they are. The third wave corresponds, of course, to the modern civil rights movement. The carving on Stone Mountain, originally begun in 1924, restarted, strangely enough, in 1964. Completed in 1970, is perhaps the most prominent civil rights era Confederate memorial in the country. It was restarted and completed in the aftermath of Brown versus Board of Education as a symbol of massive resistance to integration. As I've said before, the carving on Stone Mountain is like a giant middle finger to the federal government. Regardless of when they were installed, these monuments are symbols that tell us less about the actual Civil War and more about America's troubled racial history that followed that war. The advocates of the lost cause erected these monuments all over the country to vindicate the Confederacy at the bar of history. so that people like me wouldn't tell you they committed treason. To erase the central issue of slavery and emancipation from our understanding of the war and reaffirm a system of state-sanctioned white supremacy. Historian Gaines Foster has identified 94 Confederate monuments that were erected in the South by 1885, 20 years after the war. 406 more went up by 1912. Some of the oldest of these monuments are in Georgia. There's a pillar in downtown Athens, erected in 1872. Perhaps the most storied Confederate monuments in Georgia are in Savannah, Atlanta, Augusta. The Augusta monument contains what may be the most common inscription on Georgia's Confederate monuments. And I quote here, "No nation rose so white and fair, none fell so pure of crime. Lost cause preserved in stone." To repeat what I said earlier, it's important to remember that white Southern secessionists and Confederates in 1861 were not ashamed of making slavery the centerpiece of their independence movement. They thought the future would be better if it had slavery in it. They were staking everything. Now, slavery, again, has fallen out of moral fashion. It doesn't mean that we can just whitewash out this issue when we attempt to celebrate or memorialize or talk about the Confederacy now. If you're going to celebrate the Confederacy now, at least have the intellectual courage to be honest about what it is you are celebrating. Now, so what do we do from here? Where do we go forward? Now, are these memorials and statues public art or propaganda for the lost cause? Or are they both? If you take them down, are you rewriting history? Are you erasing history? Will we just not know anything about the Civil War? Do we know anything about them before they went up? The state of Georgia just put a monument up to Martin Luther King Jr. at our state capitol, almost 50 years after his death. Are we to believe that no one knew who he was until we put that monument up? Or we might forget about him if we take it down. Are these monuments, in fact, meant to conceal the true history of the Confederate States of America and the 7 decades of Jim Crow segregation and oppression that followed the end of Reconstruction? Are these issues best left to each community? Is there a one-size-fits-all thing? To return to a point I made at the beginning, if we put aside the haze of the lost cause, how should we think about these monuments that memorialize the combatant enemies of the United States whose success would have ultimately destroyed the Republic? Public monuments, I will say, are not history. They are a reflection of the people who put them up. They represent history only in the sense that they help tell the story of the people who erected the statue or monument. I heard yesterday that you all are thinking about putting up a marker or a monument to Phyllis Wheatley at the Phyllis Wheatley House, which is wonderful, but that says more about you, right? You see the need to right something that you saw as wrong. That is the message you send to the future about that monument. Monuments are pieces of public artwork with a very political message. They rarely have much to do with the actual person or event being portrayed other than the likeness itself. For the people who construct a monument, this is their way of saying, this is who we are. This is what we believe. This is what we stand for. And they send that out into the future. The words on the monument are very carefully chosen, as is the representation of the person. There's no statue of Thomas Jefferson that has anything about his relationship with Sally Hemings or anything about his being a slaveholder. And both were instrumental in creating the person that Jefferson was. There's no statue of Martin Luther King Jr. that takes into account the charges leveled against him of plagiarism and adultery that scholars and biographers must confront and explain when they write about these lives. You can't leave these out and be taken serious as a scholar just because they're unpleasant topics or difficult to reconcile with the person, that the public persona. That's not a choice for professional, responsible, trained scholars. Monuments and statues, on the other hand, carefully select only those characteristics and achievements deemed acceptable to the people erecting them. They are carefully crafted messages to the future, but they're not history. If you put up the monument to a donut in your backyard and someone takes it down 20 years from now, the donut peacefully went on living its life regardless of what you did or didn't do with your monument. And these people are no different. These events, the things memorialized, are no different. Now, should they be moved? Should they be taken down? Moved or relocating statues or monuments does not prevent someone from learning about that person or that event. I have heard that said to me. If you take that statue of Washington down, Stan, people want, you can't erase history. Got to take the good with the bad. And I always say, well, whenever I see a Confederate monument that recognizes what the Confederacy was all about, we'll leave that one up. You do have to take the good with the bad, but it at least ought to be honest. The Civil War as an event that took place right here. Here it is. Between 1861 and 1865 can in no way be affected by a monument put up decades later. It exists independent of what is going on over here. You take down this monument, the Civil War still exists, ready to be discovered, ready to be written about, the documents, the things that make it possible. Monuments meant to commemorate the war and the people who took part in it, whether they go up or down, have no effect whatsoever on anyone's ability to learn about that event or a person being memorialized. We have the Eugene Talmadge Bridge in Savannah, which is named for one of the Georgia governors who was the most segregated, racist individuals who ever lived. Very outspoken segregationist. We've tried several times to take his name off a bridge. We're not talking about moving the bridge or relocating or changing. Just take his name off of it. No. Well, if you do, you'll erase Eugene Talmadge from history. And I always go, if we only could. The bad he did lives on, and we can't erase that, nor would I want you to. Because he got elected 4 times, and we need to understand the people who would elect Gene Talmadge governor 4 times. The last thing I want to do is erase him, because we'll never understand the people who lived in the 1930s if we don't understand Gene Talmadge. The same is true of the Confederacy. We need to understand the people who tried to destroy this country in the name of slavery. And let me be clear, okay? In 1860, all Americans, by our standards, were racist. Northerners were no more morally superior, but we didn't try to destroy the Union in order to preserve slavery. That's a fact. That's true. Throughout all the discussions to come, make no mistake, discussion's really not about the past, but our future. I recently read a story about a minister, a man who's busily writing history textbooks that he wants schools to adopt. He believes our country was founded as a Christian nation, that the separation of church and state is a myth, that our founders were all evangelical fundamentalist Christians, that slavery wasn't that bad because it was in fact sanctioned by the Bible. He wants to reach children and young people, he says, because that way this will affect the future. He's right about that, at least, if you got everything else wrong. The way we think about the past shapes everything we think about the future. If you can get people to believe that slavery wasn't very bad, then the ownership of other human beings was in fact okay. Then you can get them to believe that efforts by people to create a just and more equitable society, from the abolitionist movement to the fight for women's suffrage to the civil rights movement to everything going on now, is founded on a lie and is antithetical to what the founders believed. After 150 years, the pervasiveness of the lost cause lives on. But we should expect and demand that real history be more nuanced and balanced, and not just parrot post-war Confederate propaganda about what the cause was and why they fought. We should never let our ancestors do our thinking for us or be blinded by hero worship, not if we really want to understand the past. And to build a better future, it is absolutely crucial that we have a better understanding and a more truthful understanding of the past. Because as I said, the way we think about the past is directly linked to the future we will create. And where do we go from here? Thank you all very much.
Great job.